And welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm here with scholar of Marxism and psychoanalysis, Daniel Tutt, host of, I guess it's just kind of like your channel now, though it still shows up on aggregators as Jouissance Vampires, but I don't think that's
Yeah,
the brand
that's right.
anymore.
Yeah, I'm considering changing the name because it was a obviously a joke of a name that came out of the Trump period with the whole backstory. I'm not going to get into, but no, I actually I have another name for it. It's called Study Groups on Psychoanalysis and Politics, which is something we started during the pandemic, and it's the same thing. It's just my program, which public education, seminars, video essays, podcast interviews, just a whole range of things.
Yeah, I would strongly suggest that your episode on Christopher Lasch with what's his name?
Lorenzen.
Lorenzen, yes, is actually quite good. Although I learned a ton from it, but nothing new about Lasch, which is not an insult. I actually think Lorenzen did a great job representing Lash's ideas, but he contextualized some things for me that I had not before thought about. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, why didn't I put Lasch in? Like, why wasn't I thinking of Lasch in the terms of Henry Miller? I knew to think of it in terms of like John Updike. That's obvious. It's even direct, but um, so an example of why people should listen to your show, because I got a lot out of that interview, even if it didn't tell me anything specific about the main topic. I learned a lot from the subsidiary topics around it in the context.
Yes. Well, I mean,
Um,
you're pretty unique when it comes to Christopher Lasch.
well, yeah, I mean, I'm like the guy who's been obsessing about him for 5 years, who's a leftist and not one of his students. Like, so uh, it seems like all his left wing defenders are literally his students, and then like three people. But
That's right. I guess I count myself among them. Uh, well, we've talked about that before, but sure,
right,
it is. Well, I don't know. I mean, there is a contingent of the kind of former Trotskyist, somewhat borderline post-left contingent of thinkers that are younger, even people in Europe, even outside of America, who are drawn to a lot of his work. People that are historians are drawn to his work. So it's not too marginal, I would say. And I also actually think that part of what I have been doing and what you and I think others have been doing is also to, if you like, redignify the actual project and to reclarify the actual project of Christopher Lasch, to take it away from the culture war dynamics, and to situate him as a person of a high level of integrity on the left. And so I think that there may be small amount of people who are trying to center his thinking, but I think it's growing.
yeah, I think. Well, this is not the topic of the day's episode, although it is directly related. So we'll let it fly.
Yeah, true.
Um, uh, I have been interested in Lash because Lash does something that really gets tried from the Lacanian French perspective all the time, which is, to figure out the tensions and exact dynamics between psychoanalysis and Marxism. And it was attempted in the Frankfurt School. Lash is kind of unique in that he's rooted in the Anglo-American Freudianism for that project. And that actually produces some very different things. And we've talked about that a little bit on our show a few months ago. But I think it's interesting how, while I have a critique of some of the economic assumptions of Lasch in his middle period, um, I think he does a better job than, say, a lot of the Frankfurt School in actually tying large scale social psychological trends to actual economic trends in not in a non simplistic, non reductive way. And
Mhm.
that's actually really rare.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a good point. I think that he does that, but he also functions to clarify what even someone like Philip Rieff, who we're going to talk about in a moment, diagnosed earlier before Lasch in The Triumph of the Therapeutic as basically the New Left was undergoing a cultural revolution that they thought was a political revolution. And
Right.
that Freud, for them, the primary philosopher was actually Freud, but it wasn't according to Rieff, it wasn't the correct Freud. We'll get into that in a moment, but it was actually the kind of libertine Freudians, Lawrence and Wilhelm Reich in particular, who, amongst many others, Marcuse, of course, is a part of that, who basically justified what he called a rich person's form of revolt. I mean, his well, we can get into it, but Rieff's critique of the Cultural Revolution in the West, 60s and 70s, is way more scathing and thorough than was Lasch's. I mean, Lasch was a part of the left. You know, we can discuss that too. I mean, but you're right. I mean, I think Lasch emerges there as a kind of offering a corrective to some of the forms of Freudian Marxism that he saw as infantile and out of touch, specifically out of touch to American dynamics, specifically. And, you know, I mean, I think also Lasch was not, we should be clear that Lasch wasn't probably familiar with Lacanianism. He had
Absolutely not.
Yeah, he had a very superficial understanding of Deleuze and Guattari, for example. He allowed that superficial understanding of their project just to discard them in a very perfunctory way. He wrote a brief New Left Review essay on the counterculture, and I think referenced them just in a few sentences. Sort of, it's always a criminal thing in scholarship when you discard a major text or a major author with a kind of bravado that leads your reader to think that you've done the homework when you haven't, right? Like, I'm thinking here of Lukács and his dismissal of, I'm thinking of Adorno's dismissal of Lukács' Destruction of Reason as a case in point, where it's like, okay, I'm going to say a few paragraphs about this work, but I'm going to do it in such a strong way that I lead all of my readers to somehow agree with me that you can just trust me, right? And that's unfortunate. That should never, just as a purely etiquette form, you know?
There is a strong critique one could make of what's called the first generation of the Frankfurt School. I call it the second generation because there's the borderline Austro-Marxist generation before Horkheimer and Lukács, and we always forget that they existed. I mean, not Horkheimer and Adorno. See, I did it too there. But there is a tendency for dismissals, and particularly Horkheimer and Adorno, that are flippant and or coded. So, for example, the reason why they kick Heinrich Grossmann out of the Frankfurt School is not the reason why they said it, like almost explicitly. It seems to be from hints that the accusation of positivism is really about him becoming soft on Stalin. Mm-hmm. And Grossmann wasn't a pure Stalinist either, but he had thought it was like he had taken up a defensive position after 1936, which the Frankfurt School, at least it's actually very hard to generalize about the Frankfurt School because there are so many scholars who aren't really part of our discussion of it that were tied to it.
You're right. It's very difficult. I mean, even if you take Horkheimer's publication of the Eclipse of Reason in the I think early 1950s in the United States, which was effectively, if you read it, it's a thorough indictment on American pragmatism and neo-Thomistic philosophy, which is basically like St. Thomas Aquinas, the tradition of Aquinas, which still permeated a lot of American philosophy in academic departments. and he took on various forms of, Jamesian thought. Basically, everything distinctive about American philosophy he trashed as justifying a kind of normalization of a society of rampant exploitation, having nothing to say about capitalist realities or oppressions at all. Anyways, some people argue that Eclipse of Reason got them kicked out, and it is true. That's part of the reason why they wanted to find a home in an American university. They never found one. So there's that dynamic. Then there's the other dynamic, which I was just talking to John Bellamy Foster, who was also on my program, and he reminded me something I had forgotten, which is that the CIA did help fund some of their re-entry into West Germany, because West Germany, in some sense, was a pseudo-occupied colony of the United States, in some sense, after the Marshall Plan. So, in a sense, I don't want to take Gabriel Rockhill's position to say that their concepts were co-opted by the CIA. I think that's no offense.
I also think we have to be very careful because not to be too much of a stickler. I mean, Marcuse literally worked for the OSS, and when we refer to the CIA here, we are actually referring to the OSS. But there's a continuity of organization. I do think, however, the interesting thing about Marcuse and the two other, I can't remember who they were. They're not Horkheimer and Adorno. The people that we know worked for the OSS because it was publicly acknowledged. They only did it during the war to fight the Nazis explicitly.
No, I'm talking about everything I'm talking about is all after. And
I know.
But it is also well established that Adorno did choose to publish even that famous essay I mentioned a moment ago, taking down Lukács's, that was published in a CIA-funded journal.
Yes.
For which absolutely. He was aware of that. You see, that's the interesting point. It's not that he wasn't aware of that. Like, for example, today, I publish different places, and it actually matters a lot to me, like where I publish. Like I publish at Cosmonaut because I believe that the readership of Cosmonaut, from a standpoint of class consciousness, is like extremely important. You know what I'm saying? So it's just odd. It's a little odd why he would choose to do that.
It very much feels to me very similar to the Congress of Cultural Freedom stuff. Like, and for those of you who don't know, Lasch actually, I started studying it because Lasch called that out in the 60s before we had the proof. Like, I'm actually thinking about how brave.
World of Nations.
Yep, World of Nations. There's a whole section about the Congress of Cultural Freedom.
That's such a nice set of essays.
Yep, it really is.
I was reading the biography on Lasch, one that came out a few years ago, and after he published The New American Radicalism, the reason that book came about is because he was invited to write all these book reviews, and that's it's basically the greatest hits of his book reviews in some ways.
Oh yeah, you can kind of tell too, because there are some times in that the book is very well structured so that you don't notice, but there are some times where I'm like, I got to go and find this book that no one has mentioned since like 1965.
Right. Like, for example, the one on the student revolt.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah.
I tried to find it. I couldn't find it. Yeah.
That one, and then like there was terminology that I had to go back and read, like stuff from the 60s, and like, what's this multiversity shit? Like, I've never even heard of this.
Right.
And there's some of that in actually A Culture of Narcissism too, where you're like, where he's mentioning specific critics by name, and like, no one has mentioned this person in 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but what I find interesting about, I think you're right, Lacanianism in America. I mean, I don't know. You will know the reception history better than I would. But it feels like Lacanianism in America became a bigger thing after the John Hopkins post-structuralism conference.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, okay.
not that they're the same. It's just to understand post-structuralism, you had to go back and understand Lacanianism, and that's when it came over here.
That's correct. I mean, but let's be more specific. Its influence was, frankly, predominantly within the burgeoning, globalizing, cosmopolitan university.
Right.
And
Oh yeah.
Most Lacanian acolytes, Lacanian thought has not quite hit the ground in a practical sense since Zizek's interventions in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And Zizek's interventions in the early 2000s probably, if we're honest, shook up in the most interesting way. A lot of people may be too young to remember this. You may remember this, Derick.
I definitely probably remember it.
You probably do. Here's my argument. Zizek's, this is kind of may sound strange to you, one of his biggest points of influence was actually in turning, around the time of the Iraq War, a lot of millennial age evangelicals against the repressive basis of evangelical Christianity.
I actually think, I wouldn't have thought that, but I think you're actually correct. And I also think what he did for me,
that's
was
partially what he did for me.
Okay.
I'm not exactly a dyed-in-the-wool evangelical. I come from a part of my family is partially, but I'm not like a thorough, like, summer church camp, like crazy speaking in tongues. No,
Right.
but I mean, I'm from a very conservative background, and part of it, that's part of the language,
I come from a very different background. I think we've talked a little bit about it, but like very working class, but working class Catholics and Jews, which is a very different set of.
That's very different, yeah.
You like concerns, and so I have people in my family who flirted with Opus Dei in the 90s and aughts, and people in my family who flirted with ultra orthodoxy on the Jewish side.
Mm-hmm.
So like that's the kind of conservatism. So the evangelical world and the neoconservative world was never appealing to me.
Mm-hmm.
But in my 20s, and this is actually a good foray into Philip Rieff, I was highly influenced by paleoconservative thought, and part of that thought that was presented to me was people like Philip Rieff, a lot of the more conservative Freudians, Paul Gottfried, McIntyre, the more conservative. McIntyre's not, I don't really consider McIntyre a conservative, but there are conservatives who like him. The conservative reception of McIntyre in the virtue ethicist tradition in the Catholic Church, and I was trying to play with like a Jewish version of that. What got me out of that world was a couple of things. One is their economics started not making any sense to me. I couldn't figure out what they even believed.
Right.
Was it paleo-libertarianism, or was it like some kind of weird distributism or whatever? I couldn't figure that out.
Right.
And that they were racist and anti-Semitic in some fundamental way. And I don't, people like that's an ad hominem. I hit an article in like 2004 or 5 by Joe Sobran that was doing blatant Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy stuff. And I was like, that's just bullshit. So that was like my first. And then Pat Buchanan wrote that book that was vaguely like, we should have just let Hitler do it. Like, I think that book has largely been kind of buried, but it was like the Case Against World War II book that he wrote in like 2004.
Yeah.
And so, and the other thing is, there's a lot of talk about the Trotsky to neoconservative pipeline, and there is some truth to it. We could talk about commentary, and actually the Congress for Cultural Freedom is a big pipeline there.
Sure.
But if you're in paleoconservative world, they were talking about that in much broader conspiratorial terms about, and much earlier than anyone on the left was. And so I am sort of like, for example, I thought that like Max Chapman was a neoconservative, which is just not true.
It's not true. It's not true, but he certainly took positions.
He was the most
very early on, even as early on as the Korean War, which were pro-imperialist.
Absolutely, and I think, I mean, that's why American Shackmanism had to like distance itself from him and find auspices under Tony Cliff from the UK, even though that's not their origin.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's true. I mean, even McIntyre, there's a new book out of all of his old essays from when he was young, in the UK as a Trotskyist and things of this nature that are quite worth reading. I think it's Historical Materialism that released it.
Yeah, I have it. It's quite good. There's two good books that I think, the book on McIntyre's engagements in Marxism.
Yes, that's what it's called. Yeah.
And then there's Marxism and Christianity, which is his later essays where he's still, I mean, McIntyre's interesting because he doesn't go neoconservative. He's really hard to categorize what he actually is.
Right. And then he wrote a book like After Virtue, which is also difficult to categorize, in which you could, if you read it, you can tell would become almost prophetic to both the right and the left. Which is why even the Benedictine option, or the Benedict option by the conservative Catholic
Rod Dreyer,
by Dreyer, is influenced by it. And even Elizabeth Brunig on the left is influenced. So, there's a whole interesting, and that's actually an interesting strategy for people that want to become thinkers and writers, to just have that knowledge about how to make a work that can also transcend sort of the divisions of your own present, and not only speak to your present, but speak. I mean, that's actually very few people.
After Virtue is still actually super influential on me. Like I'm still actually convinced that virtue ethics is. I'm not convinced of the kind of virtue ethics McIntyre wants me to adopt.
Yeah.
But I think his argument for virtue ethics got me looking at like, well, what was Marxist ethics? I was like, oh, it was proletarian virtue ethics. Okay, that actually makes sense. Let's talk about it. Like,
yeah, I guess it's the same challenge that you find in a book like The True and Only Heaven, which is, you're left with facing the question of, is this an anti-politics? And that's at the end of the day, because it's sort of a retreat from liberalism in a way, without any necessary commitment to the building of a party, and also without a strong economic component. So you have to supplement it. You know what I'm saying?
I think there's the essays he wrote in Cocoon also indicate, and that's written from about the same time. This is where Lasch starts positing like working class traditionalism, and we're all just going, what the hell does he mean by that? Like, and he drops it. He doesn't keep that up, but like that was kind of his answer for a little while, was like, we don't need we need a traditionalism based not in this right-wing bullshit, but in the habitus of the working class. But we're all like, but what is that exactly?
Well, this is something that I think is a recurring necessity on the socialist left. In fact, I mean, it's I have an essay coming out in Ion magazine that's looking at the condition of new marriage patterns for the working class, kind of trying to build off of this E.P. Thompson Engels notion of what is the condition of the contemporary working class. And based on my research, it's not looking good at all. It's not looking good at all in terms of, I mean, that's a topic for another conversation, but I do think,
I think we have to be like, I've talked about that. I think we have to be honest about that. Like this is one strain of Lasch's thought that's often portrayed as conservative that I think is unfair, because I'm like, the man knew Jane Addams' work. He was actually arguing that like the reason why we should be critical of feminists, it was the conservative feminists that get historicized, and all the radical feminists in American culture are largely forgotten. Like, that's straight up his argument. But his point about, like, well, the reason why in the 70s that you found capital so conducive to feminism, it was a way to do away with the household wage, which Lasch admits was never good enough. Like, he's actually pretty explicit about that, and actually lower the earnings potential for each individual worker, while seeming socially progressive. And I don't think he deals with some of the social benefits of that, because there are some. But
the thing that's happening now is a kind of post family fate.
Marriage is a class good now. Let's be honest.
Marriage is now. We see the rise of assertive marriage like we've never seen before. We see divorce lines falling along class lines like we've never seen before. But the more troubling trend that I've picked up on is the fact that working class people simply cannot enter into the reproductive promise of marriage and family and children, despite their wish to do so. But the way that gets translated at the level of how we talk about it in the public sphere is a clash over ideals.
Right.
Because it is true that the way that becomes internalized is often for which I think is fair, a nostalgia for the kind of promise of the Fordist era. Yeah.
Yep.
But when that promise is brought out, people are penalized for it, right?
I got to tell you, our best enemy on this is somebody I used to laugh at, and that's Josh Hawley, because he talks about the gay agenda stuff, and that's all ridiculous. But then he does this turn, and he's like, well, the reason why it's popular is, like, nobody can afford to have a family anymore. And I'm like, ooh, that turn is dangerous for leftists. Hawley's actually outflanking us on a lot of this stuff. Also, he outflanked us on the railway workers. I mean, like, not like me and you personally, but, like,
yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. I mean, a part of it is that you have to ask yourself, what was the success of the sexual revolution? And one of the domains, like, the sexual revolution succeeded, but on the terms set by Margaret Thatcher.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Right. Like, that's kind of the fact. Like, the background conditions of all of the egalitarian seeming reforms of that moment of upsurge, which Rieff, by the way, in Triumph of Therapeutic, again, says, look, this is the cultural revolution. Sexual revolution was not a Marxist thing at all. It was a professional, he calls it a professional revolutionary driven thing. Now, I think as people of the left, we should never take him at his word, because Rieff is a staunch conservative in some sense, and we need to get into his conservatism, because as you can see, every epigraph of every chapter is a quote from Nietzsche. So he's actually a great Nietzschean scholar in some sense, which we can talk about. But just to finish this point, like, yeah, I mean, even marriages in which, like, homosexual or kind of non-normative marriages, after the Supreme Court decision, I was reading some literature on this, and it's like high 90% of non-heterosexual marriages claim that the motivation for their marriage is out of love, and that so there's a kind of new contractual basis of marriage, which is no longer tied to, like, the older bourgeois ideals of sacrifice and kind of like the notion of a familial sacrifice tied into a lineage of familial expectations and the idiosyncrasies that might come from what your grandparents want for you, et cetera, like that promise. So, like, that old promise is severed, is now broken, and it is working class people who tend to be the ones that want it to be restored. And I think that's a contradiction that we have to face with a lot of sober glasses, like face head on, and ask hard questions. Ask hard questions about because you do see an accelerationist position of the contemporary family abolition movement, which is something that also needs to be thoroughly discussed and debated.
One thing I have pointed out is, like, while I am sympathetic to the historical goals of family abolition, its historical goals mean something radically different than family abolition does now, and many of those historical goals have been achieved by liberal society, period. And so, but by that we mean like open divorce, and stuff like that, like stuff that doesn't even come on the radar of those discussions now. I mean, it's just
because I mean, this was something that Philip Rieff talked about. Again, I'm just going to keep on bringing him up until we jump in, but because he basically argues that the chief philosopher of the New Left family abolition orientation was, of course, Wilhelm Reich. And one of Rieff's biggest indictments of our culture, I mean, you kind of read Rieff, and he reads a little bit like one of those Jordan Peterson caricatures of the left, a little bit, but he's obviously much more sophisticated than Peterson, insofar as Peterson's always saying, and many leftists as well, oh, it's the cultural Marxism. Our culture is somehow dominated by the philosophy of the far left. Well, Rieff kind of says the same thing. But Rieff is big on that. That's his method of historicism, in a sense, which is to say a thinker like Nietzsche, a thinker like Freud, fundamentally shapes the DNA of our culture.
One of the things I find interesting about Rieff, that's because this book I'm holding in my hands, actually kind of hard to get now.
It is hard, yeah. You can get it on Amazon, like paperback for like $35.
Yeah, it was like I paid about $35 for this, so it's just not. I say hard. I should actually say it's easy. It's just expensive.
It's expensive, and it's not in PDF.
No, there's like no ebook form of this book, but it is credited with a whole bunch of cultural reframings of Freud.
That's right.
From Paul Ricoeur, Norman L. Brown, Habermas, Marcuse, Becker, all get listed as like partially coming out of it in response to this book. And so I was surprised to learn how conservative it is. I mean, Philip, and I know Philip Rieff. My prior exposure to Philip Rieff is The Triumph of the Therapeutic, and that he was married to Susan Sontag. That's it. That's really what I knew.
Well, okay. First of all, his conservatism is somewhat detached from the predominant movements of conservative thought that we're most familiar with.
I would totally agree with you. That's why he's so different.
He's so singular. Yeah, he's so singular. Number one. Number two, let's credit Susan Sontag as a co-author of this book, which she was, because I am a huge admirer of Susan Sontag, or at least I was, and I still am to some extent, because I loved her notion of the cult of seriousness, which I try to imbue to the best extent that I can, which is something that's so lacking in our culture in America. It's such an anti-intellectual place, but nonetheless, I was reading her memoirs, and at 19. She gets married to Philip Rieff, who is a professor, and there's one journal entry. Usually, she writes effusively about her experiences of the most mundane level. When she gets married to Philip Rieff, she's just like, married Philip Rieff Sunday, April 8th, period. Like, something like that. So it's a very strange dynamic. Obviously, Susan Sontag's a part of the literati left, not not the bohemian left, like the New York literati, high society left, cultural critique left. So Marcuse wrote Eros and Civilization at the home of Rieff and young Susan Sontag. So Rieff himself was, who was he? He was a profound, old traditional humanities scholar who read everything. He's a bit like Harold Bloom. He read everything. It's not fair to say that he was just a specialist on Freud. No, he was a specialist in the classics. He was a specialist in many different languages. He was a specialist in American literature, European thought. He was very familiar with philosophy.
He's something that we don't have in academia now,
right?
Which is a broad-scale humanist generalist. Like, we just don't have them anymore.
No, I mean, yeah, he was a generalist. I mean, he was a specialist in Freud, so that's fair. He's not a psychoanalyst. He argues that Freud completes the Nietzschean project. He argues that he's a pretty interesting reader of Marx. I mean, he calls Marx a conservative. Why? One, Marx wasn't afraid to be moralistic at times. Two, Marx rejected utopian socialists, who he saw as like he calls Wilhelm Reich a utopian socialist, not a Marxist. He said he actually thinks he says that Marx would have not have liked Wilhelm Reich. In a sense, Philip Rieff writes with respect to socialism. In a sense, that's why he is like Nietzsche, a good interlocutor for the left.
Yeah, he's one of our better enemies.
Exactly. And even it's not exactly clear the basis by which he is an enemy. You know what I'm saying? He's not a hysterical enemy.
But I mean, it is important. It's funny, we were talking about this tradition, and I was like, I didn't know much about him, but a lot of the figures I'm name dropping, Lester McIntyre endorsed and wrote a long review of this book in the Manchester Guardian,
right,
which is largely positive.
Right.
There is also a sense that his relationship to Marcuse means that in some ways Philip Rieff is in the direct descendant of someone like Paul Gottfried, who was Marcuse's conservative student,
right?
Right. And a major player in the paleo-conservative movement.
Well, I mean, I think that's true. I think also the other thing to note here, like we were saying earlier with Lasch, there's a need, you could even chalk it up to a psychological need of classification, to look and rigidly put people into boxes, which is the same box that Lasch has been put in falsely. So I'm not committed to a post-ideological conception, although part of why Rieff is not easily classifiable as a conservative ideologically is because he argues as a Freudian that Freud effectively ends ideologies, because Freud discovers what Rieff calls the therapeutic, which is the best solution for the predicament of what the egalitarian changes from below were bringing about into society.
Right.
In that sense, his Nietzscheanism, by Nietzscheanism, I mean like the emergence of the last man and this whole triumph of democratic struggles from below, which Nietzsche, as everyone knows, or if they don't, they should know, was opposed to that, right? He wanted to retain something just like Rieff did. Why does Rieff start his chapters by reminding the reader that there is no great culture that will happen unless you have a stratification of the class system? In that sense, the Marxist and socialist proposition, it needs to face that counter proposition. It's like almost like we meet on the field of battle at that precise point. and ask, what would society look like? It brings us back, Derick, to the question of the equality question in some sense, right?
Right.
Because what Rieff is going to say is that society needs to accept a condition of a stratified, subjugated class. This is a fact. He says the Cultural Revolution pretends that that doesn't exist. But he actually also says that in the future, in his kind of prognostication, he tries to argue in The Triumph of the Therapeutic that, oh, yeah, basically psychological man will be in a kind of naive sense. He's very naive, actually, because he thinks in a kind of Keynesianism will be successful. He couldn't see neoliberalism. He thinks that Keynesianism will basically give us a life of undue leisure. And so, part of his lack of economic thinking, his lack of clear materialist analysis, that he couldn't see. He put too much trust in capitalism in some ways, because his ultimate argument is basically a kind of conservative nihilist argument, that too much equality. It's very, very Fukuyamist in some ways, very neoconservative in some sense. So,
yeah, but I actually agree with you in that. But I do want to point out just a little bit the people who have picked up his therapeutic argument the most, and I think they've done it partly to distance themselves from the alt-right, frankly, because they're literally their teachers. But like, Gottfried has literally done 4 books about liberalism in the therapeutic state, managerialism in the therapeutic state, etc. And I think so. I think but that means Rieff is like James Burnham in that he's both crucial to both neoconservative and paleoconservatism in a way that other people's aren't, and also in a way that makes it very hard to recognize him in anything now, because we can only recognize parts of him in movements that currently exist, but not anything like that. Because when I read this book, I'm like, well, it does feel very sociologically conservative, but in a way that feels so foreign to everything on the spectrum today. And so let's talk about his theory about Freud. I mean, because basically his conception is, what most people don't understand about Freud is that Freud is the therapeutic is a way to intervene against ideology, and that his psychology is basically a moral psychology.
So unlike Marx, who didn't think in his theory of the subject, didn't think in terms of types of rather, Marx couldn't see what Nietzsche and Freud saw, which is what Rieff calls psychological man. Mm-hmm. And psychological man is a sort of basically a kind of new form of individualism that the private bourgeois class is sort of perfecting or developing, and that will become the predominant form that will become widely adopted. And of course, he kind of recognizes that Freud emerges at a point in European society in which there's a sort of profound, obvious background of the wars and the rise of Bolshevism, and all of that is present. But what the novelty of Freud is for Rieff is his moderation, which is that he's offering a replacement of what Rieff calls faith. Mm-hmm. So Freud is a moral thinker, but he's also a new secular prophet, a new secular religious thinker, who's able to intervene in civilization and offer a cure, which is not a naive cure. Like Wilhelm Reich, one of his disciples, is offering a naive version of the cure, because what Wilhelm Reich doesn't recognize is that he thinks that the Freudian discovery of the necessary basis of repression well, then socialist revolution should be about the abolishment of repression, Tutt court. Rieff says this is a catastrophic misreading of Freud, to think that Freud would ever suggest that the human being would somehow be more healthy in a society in which repression was absent. No, Freud, the moralist, comes around to defend the private individual. That goes back to the bourgeois thing. That's what psychological man is. So the success of the therapeutic and the Cultural Revolution is a continuation of the dominance of a certain form of individualism, ultimately. And that actually is what Rieff is basically trying to say, wake up, all of you professional revolutionaries on the left who think that you just did this Marxist socialist thing. It wasn't that at all. You brought into existence the continuation of private bourgeois individualism, but you've done so in such a way that you've sapped the vitality of what it could have been. And Freud stands as somebody who's basically saying that civilization requires a baseline repressive set of ideals to be adhered to. Freud is somebody who's ultimately an anti-political thinker. What does he mean by that? Well, he means by that this is quite difficult for the feminists, perhaps, and others to swallow, maybe, or even to accept, let's say. But his argument is that Freud thinks modern society already as post-patriarchal. Why? Because every rebellion, every form of identification, whether it be in art, is reenacting rebellion. We're constantly reenacting rebellion. But at the same time, we have an ambivalent attachment to the primal scene of that rebellion. But the distance we have from that primal scene of the murder of the primal father, that was the old patriarchy. We've long since exited that. So in a sense, Freud neutralizes politics and shows, in a sense, that they can all be brought back to this necessity of deeper psychological identifications with paternal imagos that exist beyond the Oedipal stage. In some sense, the Oedipal stage never leaves politics, right? Which is why, in a sense, for Rieff, politics is like the Spider-Man meme of the Spider-Man all pointing at each other, right? That's why it's anti-politics. But Rieff says that's good because politics is bad. It's a very Nietzschean point. Why is politics bad? Well, because it distracts us. It distracts us from the truth of what civilization should be, which is great aesthetic art. You know?
Yeah. The achievements of greatness and tied to the blonde beast. The blonde beast here being a lion, but still,
it's very much like he likes to quote Schiller and like Schiller's aesthetic education of man, and
it's all the most. It's interestingly, I'm like, it's the most reactionary part of German idealism, and it's also German romanticism up to and including its total secularization and full blooming in Nietzsche. And what I find in this book that's interesting, and it's an indirect argument more than it's a direct one, and I think you're right, like, but the Nietzsche epigraphs, this does more to convince me that parts of Freud are at least were a completion of a Nietzschean project. Yeah. And Walter Kaufmann actually is the same thing in part of his defense of Nietzsche, but this is much more convincing than that.
I agree. Yeah, that I totally agree. I think that I couldn't agree more. I think that Rieff is a pretty good reader of Nietzsche. I also think that in a sense, what Rieff argues is basically that where Freud is not Nietzschean, there is an aspect where he's not Nietzschean. And he's not Nietzschean in his commitment to rationalism. And he says that Freud's commitment to rationalism, because he says you always have to read Freud as a great dualist. You read Freud, like all of that anti-politics stuff is only the dualist. It's a kind of a non-Hegelian dialectics. It's a kind of crude dualism, whereby Freud's secular faith, the commitment to the cure, the commitment to the scientificity of psychoanalysis, is premised on the knowledge of the great schism that humans find themselves in civilization, which is this unbridled, incestuous fear of the drives and how it meets a repressive culture. And it is in that conflict, in that point, where you get things like the neurotic subject emerge. And Freud's method is to basically offer some therapy, some method to resolve that. And but one thing that Rieff does say about the notion of Freud's neurotic subjects is that he says that they are all, they have very specific class and social features that make them neurotic. Usually it is petty bourgeois. Usually it's people who are born in like a rural region and they move to the city, right? Or it's people who are striving. It's like, so neurosis is born from social contradictions as much as it is that it's neurosis is not the universal condition of all people at all, by any stretch. But it is the most common form of psychic woes that Freud found in the bourgeois class that he primarily treated. So there's that dimension that's important. But then Rieff says that Freud wanted the neurotics not to reach nirvana, rather just to reach ordinary unhappiness, which he saw as the ordinary lot of all humans, which is the best we can ask for, which makes Freud a kind of very compromised realist in some sense, not a utopian at all, not a utopian at all. Which is why in his conversation about Freud's reading of Adler, very interesting, he says Adler, who was a socialist, was the most dangerous disciple of Freud, basically because he thinks Adler internalized the resentment of the working class and put it into his theories of psychoanalysis, and that Freud was opposed to it, and that Freud saw that, and he was opposed to it. And so basically he said, if any working class person follows Adlerian methodologies, is not going to go well for them, because it's too classed. Like, and that was an interesting argument, which I actually wanted to study that further.
I was about to say, I am a defender of Adler. And I think a lot of people, when they hear that, because people associate Adler with like the overcoming of trauma, and they're like, it sounds very Nietzsche. And I'm like, no, but it's a very much like this is how you empower yourself, and this is how you collectively empower yourself. Adler is a socialist, like that. Sure. It superficially sounds like the advice you might get from a libertarian, but that's not what it is. I also, one of the things that haunted me about this book is I kept on, part of me was going, well, a lot of this feels true, but unlike Rieff, I think it's bad. Like, so, you know, like
right.
So it's like, I'm like, oh yeah, a lot of people's politics is the Spider-Man pointing at each other, because it is actually, I don't mean identity politics in the sense of like the way we commonly mean it. I mean, it's literally politics as a substitute for community identity and class identity and any other thick identity. And when I'm like, oh, the individualization makes that possible. So you have an anti-political politics, a politics that doesn't actually have that much effect on the reality of politics, either for class or even administrative reasons. Like, it's just not particularly relevant to that.
Well, I mean, this is why so in his analysis of group psychology and the analysis of the ego, which Rieff says Freud wrote as a response to critiques he got from Totem and Taboo by trying to show, because Totem and Taboo was critiqued from the anthropological standpoint as projecting an anthropological past onto a present that doesn't fit. So mass psychology or group psychology analysis of the ego was turning to an analysis of what Freud called artificial groups, and showing that the logic that binds them is not a Hobbesian sort of dark sort of sense of binding of the affect through fear alone. No, Freud argues that it's fear and love combined in an ambivalent identification to leaders that constitutes the libidinal, what he calls the libidinal bond of any group. But see, here's the interesting thing that Rieff neglects, which is what someone like the Argentinian Freudian Marxist Leon Rosichner does recognize. What does Freud actually say about the artificial groups? Well, he's much more negative about them than Freud is about revolutionary groups.
Absolutely.
Revolutionary groups for Freud break the Oedipal bond with the father. They kind of have a profound liberation from what the artificial groups have. And what are the artificial groups? It's mostly the church and the army, or the corporation, business, etc., kind of ordinary bourgeois organizations. And in those, the logic is a kind of dark one. It's basically a state of infant dependency, a kind of dependency on leaders, which Freud doesn't even give the leaders of those bourgeois groups the dignity to call them leaders. He calls them directors. And Rosichner says that, in fact, you can read all of Freud's group psychology as a scathing critique of bourgeois groups. And the reason that that's not immediately apparent, because most of what Freud is critiquing in his mass psychology is Gustave Le Bon. And Gustave Le Bon was a kind of pre-fascist social psychologist, was an autodidact and so on, very interesting thinker, but he wrote all of these texts on crowd control and how to, because, this is at the time when you had like the Spartacus uprising of 1919, where like 500,000 people take to the streets, and it's like a serious threat to the social order. Bolshevism, you name it, right? These revolutions are literally happening. It's not social media, anything like that. So Freud's writing about these things, and he's writing in a positive way. But then the question is, why is it not apparent that he's positive about them? And here you have to do a lot of speculation, which I think is fair to do, about the fact that that Judeo-Bolshevism was a real conspiracy, and Freud could not be associated with it, and many people thought that he was a Judeo-Bolshevik, that his theory was. Because one thing that Rieff will say is that there's nothing in Freud that's antinomian. Okay, that may be true, but explain to me how a huge portion of Freudians are antinomian, right?
Like how people thinking the pleasure principle is good does not seem like unique to Erich Fromm or Wilhelm Reich or any of that.
Yeah, exactly. Like left Freudianism, Rieff would say, is a kind of invalid reading. That's what he would say. It's invalid. And that's just not true. It's not true. I mean, that's the subtlety and the beauty of Freud, and the difficulty of Freud, which is there is no one reading. It's a hermeneutical, varied hermeneutic, right? That you have to come at it from different places and get different things out of it. That's Marxism as well. This is why Ricoeur is right to call Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche the great hermeneutics of suspicion, which means that their hermeneutics are open. They're not closed. It's not a closed system.
It's not the hermeneutics of rejection, but it is hermeneutics of suspicion. I think
it's a good phrase. I like that phrase. And of course, there's this queer theorist Eve Sedgwick, who has recently past 20, 30 years, tried to basically argue that modern intellectual life should abandon the method of Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, should abandon the hermeneutics of suspicion. I don't know if you've read her essay. It's very...
I have not, but it feels very millennial.
Yeah, it's extremely consequential for modern academic studies. It's what's called reparative studies. So she says we don't need a paradigm of suspicion, because she thinks Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche are kind of paranoids because they see power in everything, right? They see some deeper logic at work in things, right? She thinks that she tries to make an argument from a standpoint of queer theory that all that hasn't really achieved much for us, and like we should abandon it. And so, whatever, that's a whole other podcast we can discuss. But to go back to Rieff,
I mean, that's a fascinating argument. That my that my immediate response is like, no, but
yeah,
I would have to like live with it to have an actual better response than that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I think for folks that I'm always trying to just say. You've been in academic world or adjacent to it. I've been in an adjacent for a long time. One thing I've learned is you never want to reject things strongly.
No, I actually agree with you. That's why when you posit that, I'm like, let's back away for a second, because I suspect I'll still disagree with it, but there's probably elements of it where I would agree. For example, I do think a lot of the people push against Marxism for being inconsistent on its critiques of utopianism, when you apply it to what Marxists actually do, are kind of correct. And what do I mean by that? Like, there's all these things. Well, we can't come up with the stuff in the future because that's got to be democratically decided in the future by the people who do it. And like, yeah, but we don't actually do that. Like, so, but I don't want to go back to the old utopian socialism, because most of that was kind of to be both, it was from D-class A individuals that had schemas that were frankly almost always based on some primary assumptions of which you could not justify. Like,
no, I mean, I think that's right. I think utopian socialists exist today. I think ultra leftism exists today. Like, I think that's part of what why Marxism is open as a hermeneutic, which is that certain things do repeat, not to a T, not perfectly, but there are identifiable tendencies that Lenin wrote about, which exist in our conjecture, that need to be studied. Like, that's actually part of what Mao, in his notion of the importance of theoretical investigation into the conflicts in your present, so always reminding you to do that like, yeah, do study groups, fine, but like, that's why I love these podcasts, because that's kind of what these are about.
This is also what the thing is. If you were to identify ultras today, like, and as I say this as a former left communist, right? Like,
right.
I think you find ultra tendencies, and by that I mean people who reject the needs of the classes they're concerned about and the class coalitions they're concerned about, and how those classes actually live and organize themselves based on axiomatic principles. That's not exactly how Lenin defines it, but I think it's pretty useful as a kind of modern reduction of what Lenin's talking about.
I think that's right. It's one part too theoreticist,
right?
On the other hand, it's too detached. And here you run a risk. Because it's, when you say it's too detached from class interests, first of all, you're introducing the category of interest. Secondly, you're introducing the category of, I don't know.
And then you're not dealing with the difference. The interests are not the same thing as for itself from a Hegelian standpoint, actually. Like,
there's that dimension as well. There's that dimension as well, but there's also the dimension of ideologically in a so-called post-ideological social order such as ours, you have to ask, okay, well, is ultra-leftism, in what way is it distinguishable from ultra-liberalism? This is my question, one of my questions, which makes the ultra-leftists have to ask a tough question regarding their own unthought complicities, which brings us back to the Freudian question, because the Freudian question says that bourgeois groups dominate us because they call for an Oedipal dependency and solidarity, which is unconscious.
So there's one, you always talk about this, about the thin line between ultraliberalism and
I do, yeah, it's one of
and ultraleftism, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, particularly when you look at specific movements. Like I've often asked anarchists who I even agree with on a lot of stuff, and be like, well, yeah, but you start referring to human rights, what the hell does that have to do with the anarchist tradition? Like nothing. It has absolutely nothing to do with the anarchist tradition. You don't have an alternate framework of framing what you think human flourishing is, and so you have to dip back on frankly an outdated from the liberal standpoint too, because even from the liberal standpoint, human rights are incoherent these days. Notion of what a good society would be and why we should do whatever. I mean, this is actually part of in my critique of Chomsky forever. But there is another trend in ultra leftism that is hard to explain, and that is how many of them become flat out reactionaries. Like
there's that. There's also an implicit but under argued and under theorized importation of popular frontist ideology that justifies implicit collaboration with Democratic Party, status quo, etc., often under the name of an extreme specter of a coming fascism. When you ask what that fascism is, it's basically the RNC.
Right, which is interesting because then there is a faction of ultra-leftism that actually, and not just left oppositionism, like there's a faction of ultra-leftism that even rejects the United Front, but does stand firm against that other form of ultra-leftism that is constantly running into basically opportunistic forms of the Marxist center. And I should probably define these terms for my audience because I don't throw them around that much, because I'm not sure now that they mean what they used to mean.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's true.
But historically, the Marxist center is the people who deviate from concessionist and the first round of revisionist. By that, we don't mean the revisionist after Khrushchev. We mean the Bernsteinian economistic revisionist. And they also, so they don't pull towards the quote right of socialism, which is different from, say, the right proper. And they also avoid like intransient positions that won't mediate on anything, such as invariance, which is why even though like Bordigists are Leninists, that's why they're included in Lenin's infantile disorder. One of the things that that we also have to deal with is all this is mixed up now, because I think all these tendencies are now in every single historical Marxist tendency. So it's no longer enough to say, well, you're a Bordigist or you're a councilist, you're an ultra-leftist. Now we have to look at the fact that there's ultra-leftist in social democracy, there's ultra-leftist in Marxist-Leninism. Any of these positions that can take totally like invariant approaches, to use a term from Bordigism, but like that you sometimes see even like, say, Gallan's white Maoism or something, where like, we're going to send people to do certain things because we have certain positions that we hold on to. With Gallan's white Maoism, one of the One of the more difficult ones is, for example, traditional Maoists were very careful when they reached out to peasant groups about like not sending people in who's going to immediately turn the patriarchy of a peasant group against you and get you killed, whereas Gonzalites would go like send young women in to go lecture the old men, and yes, they would get killed. And so, you know, it wasn't that the Maoists were pro patriarchy; it's that they thought they were going to have to take it apart slower. And you know, because one thing you could say about Mao, for coming out of a culture that has a strong tradition of patriarchy, Mao's writings on women are pretty decent, actually, like as far as it goes. So it's, I think that's interesting, and to tie it back into the Freudian, I think it's because I think this emerges this way in a way that Marxists, with pure Marxism, have a trouble articulating. Like, we have trouble articulating the thought processes of the, not just of the superstructure, but of relations of production, right? Like, and I think that's why things like Marxo-Freudianism keep popping up, because it's like, we know we don't have an explanation of the intersection between theory of mind, because we also know the one-to-one consciousness, like that the only thing determining your consciousness is your class position and what you do, is not true, and we don't even have evidence that Marx believed it. So
well, I mean, there's also the line of Klaus Holtzkampf and the sort of what's called Marxist psychology, which provides a much more sort of thorough rebuke of Freudianism as such. I mean, basically says, look, to summarize, he says, so it's worth looking at. It was a movement that basically died in the 90s, but it was a kind of around from, I think, the 50s up through the 90s. Critical psychology, or Marxist psychology is what it's called. And he basically says, you know, even at the level of Freud's prescriptions for the therapeutic, for free association, for psychoanalytic approach, all of it has to be sort of centered on a class exclusive methodology. It's an art form, a new stoicism for the bourgeoisie. And you know, the funny thing is that Philip Rieff would say, yes, that's right, and that's why it's good.
Right, exactly. It's like, that's the issue. Is like
that's actually why, like, when Rieff, in the section on religion here, says a lot of the same stuff that Nietzsche says.
Is that the Religion of the Fathers chapter?
Yeah, that one. Yeah, you know, he'll say like, you know, Christianity provide. You see, because part of what he's saying is that Freudianism for modern bourgeois life is replacing the function that the Christian confessional had. That's the triumph of the therapeutic. In a sense, it's a triumph over, but it's not a triumph that Freud's going to be happy with, right? Because it doesn't recognize what Christianity recognized, which is the capacity for discipline and for an emphasis on sin and for an emphasis on brutality. Why do you think Nietzsche loved Pascal so much? Because Pascal understood dialectically and had absorbed the Janus face of Christianity. He knew, he says, Pascal was someone whose face shined from repression and the discipline and the brutalism of Jansenist conservative Catholicism. So repression is something that Christianity perfected. It's a great tragedy for Philip Rieff that we're in the waning of that, right? The notion that a society could be construed in a post-prohibitory or a post-repressive age, and I don't even want to even argue that we're post repressive. I think that those arguments are foolish because
we're differently repressive.
We're differently repressive. Although I definitely agree with like some of these French Lacanians who say capitalism, finance capitalism. What I argue in my book is that finance capitalism actually creates what I call a hyper social paternalism. I'll give you a great example. Are you aware that when the sexual revolution first started out in the 1950s, do you know what some of the first feminist revolts were against? It was on college campuses, and it was against these laws. You may be familiar with them, called in loco parentis.
Yep, I'm very familiar with in loco parentis laws. We still deal with them in secondary education.
Yeah. Which stands for in the place of the parents. And it was this effort by the Fordist bourgeois family to implant a kind of continuation of paternal authority when kids went to college, you know, mostly upper middle class. Happened, I think, mostly on like Berkeley campuses. So it's upper middle class kids.
That's what the free speech movement ends up being against too. But yes,
yeah, this was the early parts of it, right? Now, the interesting thing from a Freudian standpoint is actually that's quite positive. This is why, like, we can think Freud and revolt, because what they're doing is they're saying there's an Oedipal process that we are going to college to overcome, which is what college is partially about psychically, is a kind of working out of these old dependencies, right? That's kind of what the Oedipus drama is about. So in a sense, they succeeded. Those laws were reformed, but you know what? Ronald Reagan, in his reforms of California education, bringing in high finance in the late 1970s, brought those puppies back in. And now, as Melinda Cooper shows in her book Family Values,
excellent book, by the way.
Yeah, they've been intensified since Obama, and now because they have to do with the introduction of like tort law and grievance law.
Yep.
And now Melinda Cooper shows that in loco parentis laws are not fought against because each student is a little vector of human capital, and that in loco parentis laws actually are what a lot of students lean on to fight for their own sense of persecution.
Yeah, I was about to say it is now. I mean, one of the ironies is like this very conservative instrumentation is also part of the expansion of academic bureaucracy through what conservatives might call woke means, but ironically, it is their own reinstitutionalization of in loco parentis laws that make that possible, which is my whole point about the way a lot of this stuff works is I'm like, the culture wars as we understand them are totally mutually constitutive. Right. And you see this even in something simple like Ron DeSantis. Like everything Ron DeSantis does is not only like censorious, that's obvious, but it's also bureaucratically expansive, which from a conservative standpoint,
right,
should be alerting.
Right.
But it's not, because like they're actually using the bureaucratic expansiveness that they associate with cultural war liberalism, which they attribute to Marxism, but I don't think they actually believe that in so much they even know what Marxism is.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's like if you think about it, in loco parentis part 2, after Reagan, like let's call it the neoliberal iteration of them, have now gone, according to Cooper, to shape the discourse of how the student left frames social justice as grievance, as even safe space, the notion of safe space.
Yep.
Which, I mean, so again, that's an interesting psychoanalytic shift in paternal social authority, which I think is a new social paternalism, which means that Rieff is wrong to think that somehow we're post-repressive. No, this is a different, in some ways more insidious form of repression.
Right. You and I are both on record as being, on one hand, admitting that, like, yes, we know that generations are vaguely constituted by marketing constructs. I get it that we're picked up by sociologists for like convenient reasons. On the other hand, baby boomers are fucking real. There's material things to explain there, and that means the ripples of responses throughout society that are manifested in relationships of consumption and production, do shape the most likely consciousness of the children of the, I always flip silent and lost generation. I can't remember which is which, but of the Gen Xers who have their own antinomian consciousness, basically, that has that has gone from kind of liberal anti-politics that was that it would manifest in left issues, but never in a cohesive leftism at all. See alter globalization movement, see whatever you want to see. I mean, it kind of dies with Occupy, actually, that style of politics. And then you have a Gen X right, which is overrepresented, I think, of the generation because, frankly, the anti-politics is so dominant in Generation X. That, you know, is equally antinomian, very clearly. That shows up in like, more Gen X, in so much that they support anyone, are more likely to be Trumpers or DeSantians or whatever. Part of that's age, but it's not age is defined by property.
Right.
And then I point out that, like, I don't think we're going to see a conservatizing partisan trend amongst millennials and Zs, but I do think that the structure of their liberalism is actually in some ways more repressive and conservative than they can look at.
It is, but there's a saving grace, which is that one of the things that Rieff writes about a lot is, and I think he's right about this. This goes back to a thesis which you're probably familiar with, which I've seen a lot, and it concerns me, which is actually starting with John Dewey and William James, very American thing, is, you know, the emphasis on the child as liberator, the youth as a zone of ideal freedom, etc., etc. Now, Wilhelm Reich argued that theoretically, family abolition should abolish Freud's notion of the Oedipal structure as a limited and temporary bourgeois imposition of character armor and repression. Well, that didn't happen. And on the contrary, there is a phenomenon which has been written about of how red diaper babies actually become neoliberalized.
Almost.
Pete Buttigieg,
Kamala Harris. Yeah, I could go through it.
You could go through a long list.
Right, yeah.
Although, I mean, it's not always the case.
No, there are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions. Like even the person I had, John Bellamy Foster. He was a red diaper baby, and, you know, obviously he's one of the great Marxists in America right now. But so that's interesting. But listen to this. I had a feeling that Generations was going to come. I want to read this quote from Freud, The Mind of the Moralist. Mm-hmm. Check this out. This is the anti-politics speaking here. Rieff says, quote, "In Freud's vision of politics, nothing qualitatively different happens in history. With the leader forced to play father imago because his followers are his children, politics becomes an unchanging strife between the generations. Social relations are seen through to the permanent psychological needs that they satisfy." So what I think that indicates is the danger of reducing politics. Ultimately, this is what needs to be avoided, I think, is a message I want to send here. The anti-politics is not a productive reading of Freud, actually. it's not, and I don't mean that in some idealist sense, like, oh, I just don't want it to be that way. No, I truly mean that, like, A, you can read Freud differently than that, and B, the outcome of, like, it's simply a inadequate form of thinking through political realities to reduce everything. It's a psychologistic. It's too psychologizing ultimately.
Right.
You know, it's not a materialist reading. So no. I think there's much to be said, but
I'm not. So here's what I always tell people: age is a material condition because of the context around it. However, if you think the defining thing in politics is your age, you don't really understand political subjectivities very well, beyond immediate context, which means you can't think of politics beyond nebulous cultural trends and interests. And well, I have said, like, you do have to take interest into account when you're like looking at, I talk a lot about, like, we have to have a much more robust notion of what's actually going on in the various classes a lot of the time, because the sectoral tensions and stuff actually do change. And I am glad finally that someone like Robert Brenner and Dylan Riley, even though I don't agree with their 7 theses, are actually trying to deal with that.
Well, also that Rieff says Wilhelm Reich, the errors of Wilhelm Reich are apparent if you follow where he ended up. It's always an interesting question, is like, do you judge a philosopher, a thinker, from the point of where they ended, right? As the kind of pinnacle instead of, I don't think you have to, but Rieff sort of feels that way. And what he says is that Reich was destined to end in a pure masquerade obsession with power as such, which is why he says he fell into the cockamamie orgon accumulator theory of matter, which is ultimately about taking a kind of quasi-religious conception of Freud's libido and falling into this obsession with the kind of the pure noumenal abyss of it. So he tried to abolish power, but all he ended up with was a kind of mystical subsumption into everything is just power. So he lost all dialectical mediation entirely. And I actually think that Rieff is right about that with Reich. Like Reich's project is kind of a failed project, right? Like, we do need, like, some minimal forms of repression, and we do need the creation of ego ideals, and like things like this are like the notion of abolishing the construct of the father, for example, is too radical. It's just simply too radical. Even if you want to entertain that idea, you're going to have to sit down and walk me through what you mean by that. And if you don't mention class power, as you talk about that, I'm not going to take you seriously, right? Like, I'll hear you out, but like, I just really, and it kind of goes back to I guess it's an ultra tendency. I have a hard time accusing people of being ultras, because one of my mottos, as you know, is to make peace with the radical left, even with social democracy elements, you know, which is, so that's, but anyways, the generations piece is complex. I think the other thing that's complex about it is that Freud does offer a model of overcoming of paternal dependencies. And that's how I like to read Freud. Therefore, the early protest against in loco parentis is a better model than what we're dealing with now, because they overcame it, at least for a temporary period.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think this is a good point to, like, you know, this might seem somewhat nebulous, but it's a point I think to end off on. One thing I would say is that maybe in relation to the spectrum of socialist responses, we talked a lot about ultras. People don't hear me. People will actually you know that I don't even like using the word analytically, even though I do think something like that exists.
Yeah.
I gave you like my rough definition of it.
Yeah.
What I think we have to do, and this even goes into my historical reading of like one of the problems of the Bolsheviks being tied to the 1921 faction ban, is we do have to accept that because I do think there's one of the elements of Marxism I think is slightly utopian is the idea, and I do think Marx actually believed it, that with socialism, politics ends because class conflict ends. And I'm like, but human differentiation and self-alienation does go on. And so we have to have a way for these tendencies that come out of, the struggle for liberation in our current class context to be manifested and played out within the left itself. And sometimes the side I like is going to lose. But that is part of the conception of what like working class politics and socialist politics, which I don't think are at this point the same thing. And I don't just think it's because the left abandoned the working class or the working class abandoned the left. I think the contradictions in both, in a kind of like structural way, make it very hard for either one of them to be aligned with anything. Like, so for example, this is a distinction that Robert Brenner's brought up that I actually agree with. It's hard to talk about class politics today, even when you talk about class interest politics, because they're not really the same thing. There's nothing in class interest politics that aims to unify the entirety of the working class, even though the kind of gestures toward it are there, right? So like, there's nothing about the way unions are going to manifest, even in more socially democratic societies, that actually indicate that they are actually the organ of total class consciousness. But they do show that workers can organize, advocate, and also discipline, because that part of, anarchists get mad at unions for this, but it's actually part of what unions do. And if you don't keep it under control, it will become a bureaucratic tendency. But they actually do discipline the left's militancy necessarily, like because if your collective organ can't tell you when not to be militant, they're not actually representing you. They're not actually giving your collective grouping agency at all. They're not representing anything other than like bureaucratic aggregation or something.
Right. Right.
And that's, but we won't learn how to organize. I think it's important when I talk to people, I'm like, look, the labor parties, which again, they're reformists for the most part, et cetera, but the Marxist parties came out of them. But the labor parties they came out a low point of workers organizing, but they came out of coalitions of unions.
No, like, I think that's a fair point. I mean, it goes back to this question regarding, I mean, I'm happy that Sanders has cold feet about putting his hat in the ring this time around for the presidential race, because I don't think we need him. But
I think in a way he's actually, like, if he does that, he's actually illustrating our failure. But
no, I think that I hope he sits it out, and I hope that maybe this federal thing will just kind of pass, because it's created a lot of exaggerated expectations, because we're sort of waiting for some divine miracle to happen, some thing out of the blue, when in reality it's going to take a lot more local work and struggle. So
Agreed.
Labor unions are one way to do that. But I mean, the other thing is more.
They're not the only way to do it, though.
Yeah, they're not the only way. There's we can talk more about that, but I think to connect it back to these psychoanalytic theories for a moment, part of it is that Freudian Marxism thought at a time in the 20th century, which was a form of a kind of what Badiou calls a passion for the real. a passion for a militant sense of overcoming in a total sense, like even in Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, part of what he's militating against is against the conception of the reality principle itself. So, like, we should never underestimate the grandiosity by which the theory was presented, right? And a lot of that doesn't hit the same today, the grandiosity part, right? Because of the material conditions that we're living in. So it's not sexy to take a more kind of moderate dialectical approach, but maybe in some sense we need to proceed a little more carefully. I mean, it's not to throw out the theory completely, not at all. It's rather to engage in these traditions that we have inherited with a little more nuance, you know, because there's a lot of other thinkers that we haven't mentioned that do bring, I think, a very sophisticated, like, for example, Bernard Stiegler has convinced me that Marcuse's thought is no longer relevant for neoliberal era at all. Like, it's literally.
I think I might agree.
I mean, the other thing that Marcuse did, of course, which was different than Adorno and Horkheimer, was he really replaced the revolutionary working class with a vague conception of what, after Obama, is now like cosmopolitan minority interest politics. But he tried to do that through a kind of lumpen theory, basically.
Right.
Which is also what the Lausanne-Guattari did. That's also what the Lausanne-Guattari did. Right? And that is not our future in some sense. This is, anyways.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But what I would actually even go further about, what I find interesting about that, Daniel, is like, you don't even have to look in the psychoanalytic tradition to see that. The Marxist humanists did that too. Like, that's where you see like CLR James go to. Yeah. Like, in Fordism,
part of it was valid. I mean, part of it was automation was created a lumpen proletarian crisis. To some extent it still is, but it's different now. So, you know, but the point being is that the praxis, the centrality of the praxis was put on the lumpen, and it just lacked an organizational resolve to be truly potent as a revolutionary force in some sense.
Yes.
It's a whole other thing to discuss, but
yeah, well, I mean, there's the whole debate of, like, one of the things is whenever I talk about lumpen, there's a whole lot of people who just like, it's an incoherent category, and I'm like, well, it is a difficult category, I will admit that. You might not like the branding, but when you talk about precariat or whatever, you're actually just rebranding a lumpen theory.
Yeah, no, I totally follow you on that for sure.
Like,
100%.
So we do have to deal with it, and then. Yeah. I think one thing that makes everyone uncomfortable, except for maybe like communizers who have given up on the working class entirely,
right?
Is that there are more the pathologies we used to associate with lumpenhood are also rampant in a large portion of the working class proper now,
right?
And that is something that when you talk about it, it's like, oh, you're being moralistic. I'm like.
Well, no. It also is an argument. It's also an argument, given that that's an empirical happening, that also is an argument for its incoherence, not its incoherence, but rather, and this is something I know from firsthand experience, rather it's interwoven tapestry within the working class. So it no longer necessitates, as it did in Fordism, a separate appendage. It's not like that no more, right? It's tied up and bound up with working class experience, almost indistinguishable in some sense, right?
The barriers are much more porous, except in the extremophile cases. Like,
that's right.
So it's, I mean, and that's something we just have to deal with, and I don't see people like really dealing with it right now. But
well, it's a traumatic thing. I mean, literally, it's traumatic.
Oh yeah.
When you add the drug dimension to it, when you add the overdose dimension to it,
You add the increase of the quote deaths of despair, aka class deaths,
and that's actually where the psychoanalysis comes in literally as a therapeutic, which is what Freudian Marxism also started as.
Was one of the ironies, you know. I don't always love Catherine Liu, and I don't know where she's going to go with this argument, but she started talking about the bureaucratic adoption of trauma, and I'm like, I think it's interesting because I do think actually there is a real sense in where there are much more hugely openly traumatized parts of the population, not because bad stuff didn't happen in the past, but because there was more community to mitigate incident. Anyone who's ever studied trauma knows that community mitigations can stop some of the worst effects of trauma.
Right.
However, I suspect that what we're finding is trauma is just being denuded of any explanatory force in this. I don't just suspect it. I feel like I lived through it. Like it's just also what is called trauma is expanded to the point that like no one really knows what we're talking about anymore.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I mean that's an interesting point. I mean, I'm curious to see where Catherine takes that line of argumentation. I hope that it's not down a path whereby
we just deny that trauma's going on.
There's a bit of that risk, because there is also a tendency to not deny, but to that it be missed. And this is actually a long-standing motif that you find in right-wing Nietzscheanism, which is basically because one of the consequences of right-wing Nietzscheanism, with Rieff especially, is that not only must that laboring class labor, they must also be barred from aesthetic production.
Right. They cannot be allowed to enjoy the fruits of aesthetic because they will lower it by
nor can they create it.
Right.
And here you think of the Bolsheviks and all of their proletarian aesthetic work and significance of that, but which is another reason to rebuke right-wing Nietzscheans, but and also why they play a very important kind of adversarial role to us. But I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to say about Philip Rieff, but
no, I think Rieff is interesting to me because I when I was reading this, at first I was like, well, you wanted to convince me that like that the left really should try to grapple with Freud in a way that's more thorough.
Listen to this quote from Rieff, and think about this in our current moment, and just see how it lands with you. Culture is a form of higher learning in which it is constantly assimilated. From early infancy, human beings first begin to trust those familiar responses from their parents and make overtures. In every culture, there therefore stands a censor governing the opportunity of recognizing and responding to novel stimuli. That governor, inclined always to be censorious about novelty, is what we may call faith. Right? Faith is synonymous with authority. Faith is what Freud brought in by bringing the authority of the psychoanalyst, and he often says that the transference was a proof of the success of psychoanalysis as a faith. Why? Because when you have a transferential connection, you have substituted the parental imago onto the therapist, so that the subject has transcended that attachment and placed it onto you. That's a faith. They've only done so because they've identified with you. That's the authority. Now, here's the interesting thing. He's saying culture requires a censor. Now, let's look at what the censor is in today's culture. I mean, in some sense, the censor absolutely lacks any self-legitimating authority. This is actually why I follow Lasch when he says that the censor is socialized, like it's a social superego. It's no longer instantiated in this version of the superego. That's why, you know what Lasch calls Rieff? The party of the superego. He is the man who is for the party of the superego.
Right. Yes. I'm just going back over that part of
Yep.
I'm literally actually preparing to do a solo video explaining that chapter of the minimal self, because I think it's very explanatory for a lot of things.
Right.
And yes, Rieff does come up in there. I mean, there is in Lasch a dialectic around Rieff, because some of his flotations with Christianity do seem.
You got to find the letters, by the way, Varn, because I went and I looked, and there are maybe 10 letters that they've exchanged.
Rieff and Lasch?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, wow. Yes.
Well,
okay, I got to go play in the archive.
Yeah, you know what it was? It was around the publications of Lasch's book, because you see, when he wrote his book on the family, I think he had some exchange with him. And then I think there was exchange in Culture of Narcissism, because you go to the Rochester website, you see the letters, you do a fine search for Rieff, and he appears in those sections. So I think it's letters, but I could be mistaken. They're not digitized, so you would have to go there, I think.
Yeah, well, I think my book is going to require me to take a trip to Rochester. I've already like accepted that about my life, but
yeah, that would be fun. You should do it. Yeah,
because I have a strange feeling there's a lot of stuff in those letters.
Yeah, again, this is my premonition. I could be wrong, but again, I just want everyone watching to think about. Okay, here's a man who says the future. He says something else that's prophetic. Rieff does. The future will be a war, he says, within the elites. Within the elites. So when Lasch is writing Revolt of the Elites, Rieff is in the background here as a prophetic kind of, in a sense, Rieff, I'm talking about Triumph of the Therapeutic, not Freud, Mind of the Moralist, is pointing out something right here in a way,
Yeah, I think Rieff prefigures like Michael Lind pretty strongly. Back Relief's like New Class War, which is a class war between what he thinks is the elite petit bourgeois and the professionals, and then various groups aligned with either, with the overclass just letting them fight.
And Rieff's approach in his later work, we could maybe end. I know you might have to go soon. Is in his book on charisma and so on, is a total asceticism, a total retreat politics, the scholar should be not engaged with public events at all, like just monastic almost. It's so he's sort of useless in my opinion. But would this censor of today's liberalism, what would Rieff say to this? Right? He's
right.
Probably he would be someone like the tar lady in the movie.
Yes. So we're going to end here, but I am going to ask you two things. One, anything you like to plug, but before you answer that, two, would you like to come back on in a couple of months and make the case for Lukács?
Yes. So let me answer number two first. Yes.
Okay. Yes.
I mean, which Lukács? Yeah,
we'll talk about the destruction of reason, Lukács.
Yeah.
Because that's the Lukács that you've been more interested in recently, and that's the one that I don't know as well.
Sure.
And maybe I think we do have to do a parts of history and class consciousness to really understand like what Lukács means by reason, because it's not what it's both vital, but it's not also exactly what we think by that term today.
Yeah. I would love to, and let's do it.
All right.
And great. So that's one. Two, to plug. Let's see here. Yeah, I got my article coming up. It's called The Perils of the New Intimacy. The Perils of the New Intimacy, and it's a study in Ion magazine. She's coming out soon about all of this new literature about the kind of liberating paradigm of modern relationships which I critique and diagnose. Anyways, plug that. Plug my channel, the study groups channel. I'm doing some pretty exciting interviews coming up. You can check them out. The stuff that I've done, if you haven't seen, is I think always worth looking at. The one on Lukács with Foster, Melanie Foster, is worth
Pretty good.
Pretty interesting. Really tough for a lot of folks. I mean, Lukács is going to send you in a 180, at least philosophically, from what you thought. It's a whole new cast of interlocutors that he's going to introduce to you. Many of whom you thought were boring or uninteresting. He makes them interesting. So I'll stop there. I mean, the Nietzsche book is coming out next year.
Sweet.
But really, I got some feedback from a top Nietzschean scholar that was positive, and I was so excited about that. So excited to obviously share that with you, Derick, given your deep history in Nietzsche studies.
Yeah, my love-hate relationship with Nietzsche.
Indeed.
Like, yeah, I mean, Nietzsche to me has always been the reactionary that we really have to answer, because the other ones are like, there are other reactionaries that we have to answer that aren't Nietzschean, but a lot of the other reactionaries we have to answer are also children of Nietzsche. So it's like, and one of that to me, and I think people should listen to this, because I think a lot of people, when they hear us engage on this on say Twitter, they don't know like how nuanced you are about this, because you respect Nietzsche as an enemy. like you know,
I do.
Which
I
would
to let off the assumption that I don't. So people come to my book and they're just ready for some like super flat and like boring expose. Well, you're gonna be surprised. So
right. You know, and as I'll end on this, it's way more important for us, not as a polemical exercise. And I think there's a lot of people who confuse politics with polemics and rhetoric with analysis in ways that are unhelpful. Like when I'm like, hey, like, don't pick your analytic categories by what is polemically the most useful, right? That comes up all the time. Like when people are like, well, why are you talking this way? We could be polemically. I'm like, you can do that polemically, but you need to think this other way. It would be great if we were at a point where I didn't have to tell you to switch your language, but we are not at that point.
Yeah, that's possibly part of my motivation to push a certain line with a certain bravado. One, because Nietzsche did that, and that's actually something he teaches us. Sorry to say, which I think is fine. It's a little disorienting to be that way, which can actually be good. But two, I really do honestly and sincerely think that people haven't really been made aware of this perspective. So
many people's Nietzsche is the Kaufman Nietzsche. Like,
or the Deleuze Nietzsche. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, other Deleuze Nietzsche, other Foucault Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And I've been aware that like the Foucault Nietzsche will soften in Nietzsche, like even when I was in college. I was just like,
right,
your French words do not actually what the German says. Like
that's right. Yeah, that's been proven. Yeah, that's true.
Like it's just like there's a French word that's actually closer to the German and you're not choosing it. So it's, I think that's really important.
Yeah.
But
100%.
yeah, but I also think like there's a tendency right now for people, like, I guess polemically, to go pick lightweights. Like we're going to talk about Jordan fucking Peterson again. We're talking about Ben Shapiro again. We're talking about Stephen fucking Crowder or whatever. And I'm like, okay, maybe that's useful for polemics. It's absolutely useless for sharpening your mind. Like you need to pick better, even contemporary targets than that shit.
Right.
Like I don't see what you get out of that shit.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's even before you read the contemporaries, I mean, that's actually one thing going back to Rieff. It's an old humanist presupposition that there emerge master thinkers who shape our culture, right? Now it's quite frowned upon to view the world that way. I'm sorry, but I sort of still do view the world that way, right? So, at least if you don't, try it out as an exercise and see, right, by revisiting some of these figures. I totally agree with you on that. 100%.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, and we'll see you again pretty soon. So have a great night.
It was an honor. All the best, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.